Well, hey everyone, welcome to your Enneagram Coach, the podcast. We're so excited for you to see us on our YouTube channel where our podcasts are housed. So go there, like the video, and subscribe so you can get updates on the weekly episodes. Well, we are so excited about this week's episode and our guest, because today, not only are we continuing the conversation of our new book, More Than Your Number, did release on September 20th, but we're going to talk about our EIP, the Enneagram Internal Profile, but with a very special guest, pastor and author and our good friend, Scott Sauls, who is an Enneagram Type 4. And we're going to listen and hear about his EIP as well. So then, Jeff, as you know, there's many people that have kind of started to hear about EIP, but can you just kind of give us kind of an overview real quick on what EIP is?
Sure. Well, the very concept is in the title that we are more than our number. And you hear that a lot because people get stereotyped whenever they find their Enneagram number and they don't want to deal with being stereotyped or criticized. But the idea is that there are various parts of us. And then rather than just descriptions of who we are and our personalities, what would it look like for us to take the various aspects and all of the complexity of who we are and actually being able to move towards self-leadership? Matter of fact, there's a phrase that I've heard from my recovery friends that discovery is not recovery. Mm-hmm. Descriptions don't lead us to transformation, but it is a helpful exercise to understand these various parts of us, because these are the very parts of us that lead us, that help us to live out our sense of calling. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we've been created uniquely. And that's something that we can affirm that leads us to worship, but it also leads us to humility and moves us towards people. Well, we have a great example of this because Scott has written a new book that's going to help us understand not only the Type 4 story, but how that translated into a message for people to discover the beauties of how the gospel can apply to their lives, even some of the most difficult things in their lives. And that God, in his kindness and providence, has given us a Bible that has repeated stories of how he takes broken things and makes them beautiful. Yeah. So, Scott, we are so thrilled to have you with us on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, and Scott is the pastor.
Okay, I didn't introduce.
Yeah, I'll take it. Scott is the senior pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church here in Nashville, Tennessee. And like Jeff said, he has authored many books, and the newest one is Beautiful People Don't Just Happen. Now, we met Scott back in 2003, back in the old days when we were in Kansas City. He was leading the sister church of where Jeff was an associate pastor. And you were at Oak Hills, and we were at West Hills. Mm-hmm. But then you quickly moved on to St. Louis area, where you were my brother's pastor and a very close friend to him. And then you headed off to New York to be at Redeemer with Tim Keller. And then you you moved here to Nashville, Tennessee, to be at Christ Pres. And, it's just so fun that kind of like after all these years, we get to see you here and there. And we've just heard such great things about the work that you're not only doing in the church, but also with these books and the people that you also mentor. So I would love just to start off real quickly, can you just tell us about your book? Now, we know that you identify as Enneagram Type 4, so kind of paint a picture for us of your book and what people can kind of glean from it real quickly. And then I'm sure we'll hear more about it throughout this podcast.
Sure. So thank you, first of all, Jeff and Beth, for having me on. Always love getting FaceTime with the two of you. And Patty and I, as well as our girls, have so richly benefited from your work. Mm-hmm. And before I talk about anything about me, I just want to take the opportunity in front of all your listeners to thank you.
Thanks.
I think your leadership, coaching, mentoring approach has probably helped tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of marriages, especially be strengthened as it helps us to understand each other. And so thank you for that. Beautiful People Don't Just Happen is my most recent book project. Thanks for asking about that. I think probably the subtitle tells the story of the book, which is how God redeems regret, hurt, and fear in the making of better humans. And I do think those three pain points that every human being has: regret, shame, guilt for the things that we wish we could go back and change, hurt, which is really just a byproduct of living in a fallen world and being fallen people. We are hurt by our environment. We are hurt by other people. We cause hurt for others, and also fear, just the reality of anxiety and worry and things of that sort. And so really the book just attempts at least to pastor people who are contending with one or more of those wounds, either in themselves or others. But it does so with an optimistic outlook on the kind of work that God does in people's lives, in our lives, especially not in spite of, but actually because of and through those pain points. And so really, the Making of Better Humans piece comes from an Elizabeth Kubler-Ross quote. She's a grief expert. I don't know what her faith commitment was or is, but she has this wonderful quote that inspired the book, and it goes like this. She says, "The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of those depths. And these persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and deep loving concern. Beautiful people don't just happen." So the title of the book got ripped off from that quote, which you're allowed to do. The publishers tell us you can do that with a title. So
That's great.
That's awesome.
Now, Scott, as I read through your book, this is a very personal book. You share a lot of your own story. What do you think it was that captured your imagination about God shaping beautiful people through suffering that was so personal to you? What was it that captured that idea from your own story?
Well, I mean, it's a theological truth, for sure. And I'm a pastor like you are, Jeff, and so I'm always thinking through that grid and through that lens. And from the beginning to the end, even the Bible itself was written for us by people who were contending with regret, hurt, or fear, or all of the above, in various ways and in various forms. And so I find Scripture to be incredibly relatable in that way, and Jesus to be incredibly relatable in that way. But in my own life and in my own experience, I am a regret, hurt, and fear practitioner, I guess, not by choice, but
Right.
I know what it's like to be damaged. I know what it's like to feel ashamed. I know what it is. I know what it's like to have regrets. And a recent incident that I opened the book up with, well, recent being 2 or 3 years ago. First words of the book are "You suck," and those are words that I spoke to myself while walking alone here in Nashville's lovely Percy Warner Park, because a memory of something that happened decades ago, of words I said decades ago to one of my classmates in high school in order to humiliate her in front of other people to get a laugh, is still with me. Just carrying shame and carrying guilt and regret from things that happened when I was even a kid. And so I want to speak to people who relate to that. I want to speak to people who relate to the feeling of being betrayed, or the feeling of having betrayed someone else, or to people who contend regularly with worry and fear and anxiety. I have a whole chapter about my own battle with anxiety and depression over the years. I want to pastor those people, and I want to pastor my church first and foremost. But I want to, if God gives me an opportunity to put a resource in people's hands that can help pastor them through those things, or help them shepherd someone else through those things, then just getting to release a book like this is a supreme privilege. And you're right, it is my most vulnerable book. Somebody asked me, how would you describe this? And I would say, I guess it's a Reformed Presbyterian pastor's attempt to write his own version of the Ragamuffin Gospel.
Yes, Brennan Manning.
Brennan Manning. It's it's been one of he writes from a Roman Catholic perspective, alcoholic, contending with all of these same kinds of things, and that actually has been one of the most impactful books on me over the years, and was introduced to Brennan Manning through a musician that I really resonated with, who I think had to be an Enneagram 4 also, named Rich Mullins. So anyway, it's my attempt, from my own perspective and theological background and experience, to write a book like that in hopes of showing people Jesus in those books.
Well, there's so many different things that we're going to pick up on as we walk through the Type 4 EIP, and the various parts that carry these things of regret and hurt and sorrow that over all of our lives and our stories. And so, Beth, for our listeners, why don't you go ahead and start off with an overview of the Type 4, and then, we'll go from there.
So Type 4s live primarily in their imagination and feelings, but deep down they have this hidden idealized self, like a vision of themselves that they're passionately the most incredibly socially adept person, that they're universally desired. But when they measure themselves against this idealized self, they're constantly feeling they're coming up short. And so this is where they feel that they're somehow defective and flawed, and believe that others have the qualities that they're lacking. And so this envy rises up within them. Now their focus of attention is longing for what's missing, and they're wanting to bring what's missing into the forefront so that they can experience that real beauty and authenticity and depth and that idealized self that they really long to bring to the world. Now, 4s have so many great strengths. They are rich with meaningful emotions and experiences that go very deep. They're incredibly intuitive and creative. They're authentic about their feelings. They're willing to sit with people right where they're at, no matter whether it's beautiful or hard or struggling or sorrow. They really can sit with people in those hard spaces. Now, they have core motivations like all of the types, and we want to look at the 4's core motivations because that's really where everything hinges from. So their core fear is the fear of being inadequate, emotionally cut off, plain, mundane, defective, flawed, or insignificant. Now their core desire is to be unique, special, and their most authentic self. And they have a core weakness of envy. Now, this is where they're feeling tragically flawed and that something foundational is missing inside them. But again, others possess qualities that they feel like they're lacking. And their core longing, the message their heart longs to hear, is to hear you are seen and loved for exactly who you are, special and unique.
Scott, what was it that resonated with you the most when you discovered that you were Type 4? Because like many people, you had kind of toyed around with maybe some other types, but then landed on being a Type 4. What was it that really caught your attention?
Ian Cron. So I went on his podcast. I went in to interview with him on his podcast as a 3 and left that interview as a 4.
That's awesome.
He's like midstream. He's like, you know what? I don't see 3 energy from you. I see 4 energy. I don't see, a guy who wants to work the room. I hear somebody who, resonates with being a poet, those kind. And of course, Ian's a 4 himself. And I thought, maybe so. I had thought I was a 3-wing 4. But that conversation sort of triggered more reflection, and going home to my family, talking to them, and they're like, yep. So yeah. And which actually for me, the 4, I guess you either love being a 4 or you hate being a 4. Cause it can be this brooding personality, this when you get into a funk, or when you feel the world's pain really deeply, you can kind of fall into this Eeyore-ish, type of thing. But it's also the personality of the tortured artist, like the most creative people whose work we love and cherish and speak so much to us about the beauty and tragedy of the universe and the world in which we live. Those are people I have always looked up to all of my life and have just been enthralled by their work, whether you're talking about a novelist or a musician or a painter or what have you. And so I kind of feel like, I'm in the club of those people. And it's interesting, how, well, I could go on about, the wounded child and beloved child as you all, sort of frame them. And I can see myself both wholeheartedly in both of them. Really, every description, there's not a single exception in this full page of many words, both on the wounded child misaligned side and the beloved child aligned side, that doesn't resonate when I read them.
Yeah.
So that's probably
That's
more
a great
confirmation.
segue.
That's right.
Oh,
well,
great.
why don't we define some of these terms, because this is going to really help to clarify what Scott's referring to. So how we divide up the main type, that it has two parts: the misaligned wounded child and the aligned beloved child. And so we're going to just start with a description of the wounded child. The wounded child is the part of our main type that carries the burden of living in both a sinful and fallen world. It's the vulnerable part that carries the trauma, the tragedy that we face. It reacts from a place of a painful history and the primal need to protect itself from harm. As a child, type 4s long to hear that you are seen and loved for exactly who you are, special and unique, with longings, feelings, and passions ran deep within them, and they used emotions as their primary source to build their unique identity. That this wounded child felt disconnected and misunderstood by maybe both parents to some degree, which led them to assume that there was something fundamentally wrong or missing or tragically flawed within them. So they believed that they needed to be different and unique to stand out so others would see them and have reason to love them. Discovering their unique and authentic self became a primary focus for their life. See, the wounded child for a type 4, that it's not okay to be too much and you're not enough. It's a longing to be unique and to feel accepted and not feel too unique. But as an adult, the type 4's core longing remains the same: to hear that you're seen and loved for exactly who you are, special and unique. So to assist in bringing healing to our wounded child, we must begin to see and actually honor this part of our hearts, because it reveals something about what we were made for, and it reveals something about what's true about our world. But unfortunately, this part of us was ill-equipped to handle some of the problems. So Scott, would you mind sharing a little bit, maybe from a memory from childhood, about as you think about being a type 4 and how your wounded child really showed up for you?
When I was a kid?
Yeah.
Or whenever.
Yeah, or whenever this kind of broken part of you. I mean, even hearing you share that earlier about the opening to your book, You Suck. I mean, that's a part of you that looks back, that says, that I was harmful in the lives of others in order to really address what was happening inside of me.
Yeah. I think, man, I'm still, peeling the layers of the onion from, the childhood experience and how that shapes the people that we become for the rest of our lives, or at least, contributes to that shaping. And, without going into too much detail, I'm an abuse survivor, from a very young age, that was chronic for a number of years. It was ongoing, and didn't recognize it at the time as any sort of unique form of trauma. Just thought that was how life was, and that's how kids were treated. And I think my internal reaction to that, because part of the abuse was being treated as worthless and useless and small and not enough, all of those things. And I turned into an achiever, which I think is where some of the three comes out. but the internal motivations, I think, trace back to the 4. And that is that achievement became my vehicle, my primary vehicle for standing out, for being unique, for getting noticed, for being appreciated, for my uniqueness being to win. I was a state champion in tennis. I was selected to be one of the top 10 basketball players in the state of Georgia in high school. Was never really happy in any of that, because really the whole motivation, the whole basis for, behind all of that was to kind of reverse the narrative, to reverse the negative verdict that has been repeatedly pronounced over me. But really the core was a hunger and a chasing for a love that I didn't know. It became easy to replace the affection and love of those close to you with, the applause of the crowds, and to kind of look at that as a counterfeit and treat, and that became kind of a counterfeit way of fulfilling those misaligned, wounded child longings. But in retrospect, it's also, in kind of teaching myself to be an achiever, on the upside, when I'm in a healthy place, I work really hard. I keep my commitments. I show up, and I show up especially for wounded people. And I think I'm able to show up really well for people in a place of trauma and woundedness, as people tend to be able to do for those who are going through things they've been through. When they're at a healthy place. But that's the challenge, is to right. Constantly be fighting for health, which is something that, 4s especially can slip off the wagon pretty easily and become that brooding, negative Nelly, Debbie Downer, which who wants to be that,
Yeah. Well, Scott, you're alluding to something that is something really beautiful about this, and that there's these parts of us that can lead us away. And when we talk about the idea of being misaligned, it's Paul's words to Peter in Galatians that he's no longer in line with the truth of the gospel. And that these parts of us that are broken actually become instruments in the Redeemer's hands, that it's a part of who we are and our sense of calling. So Beth, why don't you talk about the beloved child and what that looks like for the type 4?
Yeah. The beloved child knows who they are and whose they are. They know that Christ has satisfied their core longing. And the outpouring of this is satisfaction and joy. It's the overflow of their heart. And so for the type 4s, their beloved child, this is that spirit-led self, and it knows that it is free from feeling shame, rejection, or thinking that they're defective and flawed. And it's here where the type 4 can rest, because it knows that the eyes of the one that created them fully knows them, like sees them for who they really are, more than they even know themselves, and knows that they're special and unique in his eyes, and that there's nothing missing, that they have all of Christ's blessings. And this is where the beloved child of the 4 can say to themselves, I am not too much, nor am I not enough for others. God created me in a beautiful way, and I'm a part of this bigger story, this tapestry that God is weaving together, and I am this glorious, beautiful thread that shines brightly, and I belong. So Scott, how does the beloved child part of yourself show up in that spirit-ledness, and how does it lead the church and mentor others and write your books? Where does that really show up, and how?
Gosh, that word belong, that you finished your remarks there with, Beth, is the longing, is the ache. I think of, it's probably the ache on some level of every human heart. It's not good to be alone, as we were told long ago. But it's a deep longing for people who are wired with the number 4. Your question, how has it shown up, in writing and pastoring and those sorts of things? I hope I'm answering the question that you asked, or that you're
or
meaning
just
to ask.
how do you experience the belovedness,
Y-
rise up? It doesn't even
yeah,
have to be in a specific area. Just,
yeah.
yeah. How does it show up?
Through surprising revelations of the people that I have solidarity with. Give you an example. That's one, and the number two is through beauty that shows up through tragedy. So I'll start with number one. I was in a conversation with a Nashville artist named Andrew Peterson, and we're talking about being a four and how it feels like we're trapped, in a deep feelers existence. And I remember one of the things that he said in that conversation is, most of the time when I walk into a room, even of friends, I assume immediately that I'm the most annoying person in the room. In other words, there's this alien feeling that we fours have in every situation that we walk into. I feel that way when I walk into the church that I pastor. I feel that way when I show up at the dinner table with my own family. I feel there's a part of me, I don't feel completely alien or alienated, but there's a part of me that just feels like I don't completely fit wherever I am. But then to hear somebody like Andrew say that, and I experience Andrew, and Andrew's friends experience Andrew as the favorite in the room, because of the other four aspects of
Yes.
just truth and beauty, and how he wears it on his sleeve, and how he tears up at tender, beautiful, tragic things. Russell Moore would be another great example. I'm trying to think of people who we get to know because we live in this wonderful town where
Rachel
all these people
Lyons.
are. But
Rebecca,
are also,
Rebecca Lyons.
Yeah, Rebecca Lyons is another four. But yeah, and these are people who are recognizable. Which is, I'm not trying to name drop. I'm just trying to be relatable with people that your listeners would know them and look up to them. But Russell Moore, another one. Like, I think, this beautifully gospel-centered prophetic, no that he says to injustice and abuse and untruth and bullying, like the platform that really injured him, because he had that platform and yet helped so many of us put words to the way that we're feeling about certain behaviors, especially in the church. He's such a treasure. And I think, okay, gosh, if I'm in the same, and he would also probably on some level express that alien feeling. I feel like if people like Russell Moore and Andrew Peterson are saying, I feel like an alien, but at the same time, these are people that I feel so at home with, not only with what they put out there, but just with their presence. It gives me hope that maybe I'm not as annoying as I feel like I am. But then the other is tragedy, and how it shows up, right? So my wife and I just went to this beautiful production of The Hiding Place, which is the story of Corey and Betsy Ten Boom, who were Holocaust victims as Christians who gave refuge to Jewish families, and they were in a concentration camp. Betsy died in the concentration camp. All kinds of injustice and just horrific realities, portrayed in this artful presentation of The Hiding Place. And there's this scene where Betsy, they're living in this flea-infested room that the Nazis put them in with a bunch of other people. And Betsy turns to Corey and says, we can rejoice over the fleas because the officers don't want to come in here and hurt us because they don't want to be around the fleas. And just, everybody else, I'm looking around the room, it's dark, but I'm like, am I the only one who's weeping right now, who is so deeply connecting? Because that statement to me, again, it's kind of the beauty in a tragic place motif that fours are so drawn to, like that, like we're able to say yes to redemption statements and moments that sneak their way into the world through completely tragic, devastating circumstances. And I know it feels like a weird way to connect to God, probably to most people, but Christ becomes more real to me in that kind of expression than any other expression. Like, I don't have much patience for a worship service that's all positive, for instance. Like, I need Psalms of lament, and I need reason to grieve and lament the tragedy of the world in which we live as a realist. But I also need my 7 friends to sit next to me, in a worship service, and so I can draft off of their joy and their celebration and levity, because Christ has overcome the world. We need each other in that way.
Well, it reminds me of that movie title, Collateral Beauty.
Yes.
I mean,
Will Smith.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful title, Collateral Beauty, like the tragedy, and yet there's beauty in it, if you're able to sit in it long enough and pine for it. So,
well, I mean, hearing you say those things, Scott, and I can see the little sign that you have on your shelf behind you that all sad things become untrue. The 4's heart invites us. Now, there may be an unhealthy part of them that it invites us to just being surrounded by the sorrow that's happening. But 4s have this incredible ability to find beauty in dark places, and for us to not have to avoid them or be afraid of them, but to walk patiently with them, knowing that our Heavenly Father is actually going there with us. So if we get close enough to a 4, they actually invite us to more of the reality of what is.
Well, and Jesus was called a man of sorrows, and I think 4s give us a glimpse of the heart, of that part of the heart of Christ.
That's right.
Yeah. It's a protest. It's a protest against everything that vandalizes what's good and true and beautiful, because that's the deep core longing of a 4, and really I think of most humans is that which is true and good and beautiful. So this sign behind me that you just referenced, Jeff, it's a quote from Lord of the Rings. Samwise Gamgee asked Gandalf the question, "Will all sad things come untrue?" But this sign was actually made for me and sent to me by a mother in our church on the 1-year anniversary of her 13-year-old son's suicide. Sitting underneath the sign is this folded up handwritten letter that she wrote of 4 or 5 pages, essentially rejoicing in the beauty of God in the face of tragedy, and protesting what happened to her son by living in hope. And so, that's another one that just, a story that gives me chills, and, I can sit with that and am energized by sitting with that all day long.
Yeah. And Scott, I'm assuming too that is it fair to say that she sent that to you because you've been such a gift to help her to navigate that?
Well, I think our church community is remarkable at showing up for people who are on the ground, devastated, and a lot of the communal redemption in our church community happens when tragedy strikes and the community flocks to show up in meaningful ways that I think demonstrate the heart of Christ, and hers is another example. I cannot take credit for that personally. I mean, I think that's just a function of the community of showing up for her in ways that, frankly, she has made a life of doing for others.
And I think that's true, though we've been in churches where, maybe the leadership wasn't comfortable sitting in hard places. And when the hard things came up, they kind of wanted to be like a rock on, the lake, skip it, skip over, we'll touch it just a little bit. We'll pray for you. And so why I'm saying that is I just think you as a lead pastor and a type 4, you lead and you show and you mentor and you shepherd your flock in such a way that they then emulate that as well, like how to sit in hard places. And so you may not have sat with her on all the moments, but you've also taught your flock how to do that, which is really incredible.
Well, why don't we dive in? Scott alluded to it a little bit earlier about wings,
Yep.
and so talking a lot about his 3-wing. So these various parts of us, we don't become those parts, but we just take on certain attributes because they are operating on behalf of either the wounded or the beloved self, and they can be both and everything in between. So the type 3 parts, optimistic, accomplished, adaptable, and driven to excel in all areas of life. Now, you'll notice that can be very different than the type 4 description. So that means that there's ambivalence. There's a war going on in the heart. They try to earn love and admiration by becoming successful and unique individuals. They might forego authenticity and shapeshift into a particular image to gain praise from others, since they envy what others have and what they feel, and they feel that they lack in some way, that they can express a surplus of confidence in unique qualities, work, or accomplishments to be seen and admired. But when a type 4's wing 3 part trusts the beloved child's leadership, it no longer needs the unhealthy strategies to protect the wounded child. And from this place of trust and rest, a type 4 may notice that this 3 part of them may have a healthy self-confidence in who God created them to be, and that they no longer need to strive for love and the admiration of others, that they can recover more quickly from emotional setbacks and to continue to make progress versus getting caught up in the tsunami of their emotions. And they actually can help them become more optimistic, friendly, upbeat, hardworking, and able to accomplish a great deal. So you talked a little bit about what that looked like as a type 3 whenever you were young, and particularly athletic accomplishments. What did it look like in the healthy sense of you being for your type 3 wing?
Yeah, because the 3, I just want to say, like a 4 with a 3 wing or a 3 with a 4 wing, that is just a huge battle inside. Because one is trying to look the part and basically not be authentic, right. And the other part is like, oh no, we must be authentic. How dare you? And so there's this battle that ensues. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that battle, plays a part in your life as in general.
I think the way that you just said "we" instead of "I" is very telling. It's like we're Gollum, right? Gollum in Lord of the Rings, speaks about himself in the plural.
Sure.
But the 4. I mean, I joke about this with other people who are wired similarly, that the 4 and the 3 hate each other, and yet they desperately need each other at the same time,
exactly.
right? Because the 3 helps the 4 come out of this kind of isolated, place in the corner. I'm all alone. I'm so unique. I'm nobody gets me. Needs the 3 to say, "Come on, let's get out in the world." And then the 3, needs the 4 to say, "You really need to get over yourself and realize it's not all about you."
Scott, every once in a while, some people that on the podcast will do what you just did. And I ask the question, is that the voice of your 3 part? Like, hey, bro, you got to get your stuff together.
Yeah, right. Well, that's why I listen to a lot of you too, because like one song is a 4 song talking to the 3, and another song is a 3 song talking to the 4. But Bono's got to be a 3-4 or a 4-3 combination. But I mean, it's an inner conflict for sure. I think in my experience, at least, Jeff, Beth, the goodness of it is I work really hard, and I have an ability, I think, to say things beautifully on certain subjects, mainly because of other people that I've been impacted by and learned from. But in other words, to say things beautifully, meaning that I'm wired like a poet. I'd rather speak to you poetically than just factually. But people who speak poetically and factually, there's this sort of stubborn principle that we have is you don't do that for a platform. And you'll hear this from true artists. Like, the moment you start doing what you do in order to sell records or in order to to build a crowd is the moment that you've sold out, and it's the moment that your art is going to become less creative and less beautiful and more commercial. And so like the true artist really resists that. Like Kurt Cobain killed himself over that. Like it's such a like he was getting famous, and that's the thing that really destroyed him, internally. But you need that 3, or at least I need the 3 to say, look, like if you're going to be a poet, if you're going to say things that you believe are true and beautiful, don't you want someone else to benefit from the uniqueness of that? Don't you want others to like there's such thing as a healthy platform that brings good into the world? Like, why on earth do you think that Jesus, deputized through the Holy Spirit a 66 book or 66 book, the Bible, that's all about him, to tell the whole world about him and to draw all people to himself? Was he an egomaniac? Absolutely not. He was the humblest man who ever lived. And yet he brought such a value in truth and beauty and grace and love that he recognized that the world would be impoverished without what he had to bring. And I think each one of us, created in the image of God, is a small but significant microcosm of Christ. Like the word Christian means little Christ, which means that each of us has a uniqueness that's meant to be shared and not hoarded. It's actually a moral imperative in the Sermon on the Mount, both to not do your religion to get applause from people. Don't use God in order to stroke your own ego on the one hand. And yet in the same sermon, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. You're a city on a hill. You're the salt of the earth. Don't hide your light under a bushel. Make it shine so that all may see it and glorify your Father in heaven, right? And so if we can find that place of sharing, what God has entrusted to us to share, in your case, books and podcasts and, all the wonderful insights that you've learned, around the Enneagram. But to do that from a humble place, recognizing you're stewards of something that God's entrusted to you, rather than doing this in order to, work out your, whatever issues. Like there's a healthy way to do platform in the same way that there's a healthy way to do silence and quiet and isolation, and there's also a shadow side to both of those. Yeah. So the key is to be helpful.
Well, Scott, in your book, I remember it kind of was a little bit of a gasp or a like, huh. But when you came this insight where maybe it was your therapist or coach who had said to you, like, I think you need to see a trauma specialist. Mm-hmm. Was it part of your 3-ness that helped you to engage with that maybe in a different way than maybe you had in the past?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about that, Jeff. I pursued counseling just because really, it was really kind of a midlife thing of, asking the question, how do I want to finish? If I've got 15 more years of pouring in the lives of other people vocationally, getting to do what I do, which is primarily pastor a church. How do I make sure, especially in the climate that we're in right now, where so many large church pastors are, not finishing well and sometimes lose their ministries way prematurely because of, some kind of breach of character? Like how can we put force fields of protection around ourselves to make sure that health is protected? And so I sought out a counselor to help with that. And he said, this is going to probably need to go a lot deeper than you thought it would, because I'm seeing some things in your story that look like trauma to me. And when there's trauma that hasn't been unearthed and addressed in a safe, protected, context, it's going to leak out and bleed out sideways one way or another, even when you're at your best. If you haven't, done the work to really unearth those memories and deal with them and face them head on. And even that is a traumatic endeavor to kind of dig up stuff that the subconscious has buried in order to kind of protect you and enable you to function. But it comes out in the form of insomnia, for instance, which has been a problem for me for about 7 years now. And that, Jeff, my counselor, was able to say, look, your insomnia, I think is related to, I don't think it's biological. I don't think it's that your circadian rhythm is out of, I think it's your trauma from 45 years ago. Finally talking to you loud enough for you to get help. So yeah.
Well, and I think, like when I hear you talking about the 3 and the 4, what I hear, the beloved part of the 3 is he's the champion for the 4. He's the one spurring the 4 on, saying, you've got so much to offer. Don't hoard this. Let's get out there and let's give it to others. And so the 3 part, and that's where I think it's so important for us to see how these parts benefit us. But if you don't take the time to see how they benefit us, you're going to actually hate that part of you, because there are times that it is hard and it's annoying and it pushes you in places you don't want to go. I mean, like for me, I'm a 9 with an 8 wing, predominantly. And I can tell you, I love her, and she can drive me crazy because she can get me in so much trouble sometimes. And yet she's one of the very reasons why your Enneagram coach is even here. And so just to hear that 3 part of you, though there has been a tug of war within you, it's that very part that writes the books. I mean, there's other parts of you and we'll get to that, but it's the part of like let's make a list, let's accomplish this, let's do it. And I love that. And I think it's so important for each of us to recognize our parts are beautiful when they're aligned with the truth of the gospel. And that's what we have to keep fixating on. Well, hey, let's jump to your other wing, which is the type 5 wing. And type 5s are the observers of the world. They're curious. They crave to learn more. They want more resources, but they do fear they're going to struggle with catastrophic depletion from others. So they're going to tend to pull back and kind of withdraw from people. And the 4s will do that too. So when the 4 is misaligned and following the wounded child, they can become very independent, putting up big boundaries, not wanting anyone to invade their space. They want to sort out their thoughts and their feelings alone, bringing their intellect into the forefront. And they believe that their emotions people are going to not take them seriously, so they really want to hold tight onto those. But when the beloved child of the type 5 is in the lead and navigating for the type 4, what you're going to see is this combination of intellectual insights and emotional intuition, which produces like this stunning original works. And they can be super genuine with the information they've gathered, but also their emotions. And then they want to connect on that emotional, intellectual level with others. So Scott, how has that 5 wing part of your heart shown up in different ways, whether wounded or beloved side?
So,
Scott, I've never seen you without books behind you.
Right.
It's all a prop. It's all a show. They actually don't have pages in them. They're just boxes that look like book covers. No. I am a pretty voracious reader. It comes with the territory of what would have been called to do. I love words. Sure. I love, being able to harvest, beautiful words that other people have spoken, both for my own enrichment. And that might be the 4 in me constantly looking for beauty in what other people put into the world, so I can, hold on to it as a resource. But also it comes in handy for sermons and book writing, and also just for meetings, with people who are going through this or that, to be able to cite something that Dostoevsky said, or something that you guys said, for that matter. I'd love, by the way, before this podcast is over, to get to share with your readers my impression of your new book, because I think it's a really important thing that you did in writing this particular book, because you speak so directly to the heart. And I mean, it's like I would say it's probably worth $2,000 worth of counseling for $18. And so your listeners would do themselves a big fat favor. But I'd love to even just share my endorsement of that book which was a privilege to do, at some point before this is over with. But in terms of the 5, I've answered it for myself, but my wife is actually she's a 6 with a 5 wing, and to get to live with her, even though I'm probably more of a 3 wing, there's just that 5 part of me that cries for attention over here on the other side of the 4 is so deeply nurtured by her, because what she wants to do as the 6 is she wants to connect. She wants to nurture that relationship and pull the introverted 4 out of me. Even though she's an introvert, she's got this thing about her as a 6 that's constantly wanting to connect. And one of the ways we do that is where our 5 intersects, which is quite wonderful. She's quite a wordsmith herself, and writes beautifully. She writes for pretty regularly for She Reads Truth, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. But yeah, I don't know how I got off into the marriage part of it, but so much of my 5 is nurtured, I guess I want to say, in community, right, with my wife, who draws that part of me out really well.
Well, Scott, you actually stumbled onto something that Beth and I, in our own story and working out EIP ourselves. But so Beth's 8-part. Now, this is advanced EIP stuff, so more than one number. Mm-hmm. We actually have all parts of us. She's giving me the oho because she knows where I'm going here.
I'm giving you the oho.
You're giving me the look. I felt the look. I don't even have to look at you, and I feel the look.
You're assuming.
So, sorry, Scott. You had to participate in that, and our listeners. But Beth's 8-part, she calls her Regina, and that's her wing.
Yeah.
But I, too, have an 8-part.
You do?
And I thought I was an 8 for a while, but I wasn't. That was just to cover up my own fear and think I'm more confident than what I actually was. But I call mine Reggie. And Reggie and Regina have a relationship with one another.
Oh, yeah.
Whenever that part of her shows up, our fights escalate quickly.
Yep.
But you're speaking to something like there's also other parts of us that help us to connect with our spouse.
Oh, yeah.
And there is some fun times whenever I'll say to Beth, you're thinking like a 6.
Yeah.
But you can't handle this neighborhood.
Yep. When I get stressed, I get stressed, my mind just goes crazy. And he's like, "Hey, why don't you just stay over there? I'll handle it over here."
Take care of this now.
Okay, so what I really want to know, feel free not to answer this.
No, it's great.
But do you guys sometimes, because of the knowledge that you both have about, the misaligned, aligned, beloved, wounded dynamics of your respective types, are you ever tempted to say, "You're misaligned right now"? Do you guys pull out your kind of therapeutic knowledge to score points in arguments with each other?
I would say
I have never used my theological or pastoral counseling in order to win an argument, Scott. I would never do.
You don't seem like the type who would, Jeff. So
no, I would say, just like everything, there's the wounded part that comes in and the beloved part. The wounded part that comes in is usually defensive, posturing, trying to point out something.
You're talking about Jeff here, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, of course you.
But pointing out something in hopes to get this ship turned around or not have to deal with it. So there's definitely the wounded part, but that never works, right? I mean, those strategies never work. But I will say what's really helpful is the more we learn how to do this and learn how to dance right, we are able to hear each other's wounded part and misaligned part. And actually, we were just talking about this yesterday on a drive, and not panic and not freak out and not try to fix the person, knowing that we're each on our own journey with the Holy Spirit, who is the one that's going to work in and through us. And so What we're really wanting is for each other to come alongside us in the journey. And yeah, definitely point out some things. There's sometimes Jeff's like, hey, who am I talking to right now? Because like my one part can really be beating me up with a lot of criticism. And is that really Coach Beth, the healthy part of my type 9, or is that someone else? And so he'll even kind of say it gently like, hey, who's really here? And that's just a soft way of saying, I'm here with you, but I think you need to become aware of what's actually happening. And so they're definitely both and. Like we can definitely use this knowledge in a way, probably I wouldn't say ever intentionally, because we've learned a long time ago not to use it as a sword or as a shield. But inadvertently, there's times that we use it in ways that can land on one another in the wrong way.
Sure. But it is true, Scott. There is a way of using this that's actually harmful, versus recognizing that someone's actually working out something that's even bigger than you as a spouse, but you just have the privilege of being there in the moment. Mm-hmm. And the longer that we've been married, as we've endeavored to believe God's grace for one another, we create space. It becomes a much more hospitable place for one another whenever we do get spun out and disorganized.
And you probably would agree with this, Scott. When we were newly married or young in those first maybe even 10 years, which some people are like 10 years, you're trying to fix one another, right? Like just make this stop. And the older you get, you're like, you know what? It's all right. We're still in this. We're going to be together. Yeah. I love you. You're going to falter. It's okay.
Yes.
I mean, isn't it liberating in a covenant relationship where you discover things about each other that are wonderful and really frustrating all at the same time, to believe good theology and anthropology about one another, that I am never going to be married to somebody who is not unfinished. Yeah. I am confident that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it, and all the way until and all the way up to the day of Christ's return, when he makes us complete finally. But I don't know, just having those theological categories to kind of relieve the pressure, to open the pressure valve on our expectations of ourselves and one another in such a fragile relationship like marriage, and such a potent relationship all at the same time. I don't know. I don't know how a marriage can last long without that kind of resource that removes the pressure on ourselves and on the other to achieve something that's unachievable, and that is the fulfilling of all my expectations.
I remember being on a treadmill back in St. Louis when we were in seminary, and I was praying through this kind of personal and marriage prayer journal, lots of verses in it, and it was really helpful. And I remember just kind of like praying specific things, hoping that God would change Jeff, And I just had this like the Holy Spirit moment where I was like, Beth, if God wanted Jeff to be where you're praying for him to be right now, he could totally do that. But he has a story for Jeff. He has a path for Jeff to learn certain things along the way. And do you trust me to allow those things to transpire in the timing I see fit? And of course, there's part of my heart that was like, no, that's why I'm praying. Let's do it now. But no, it was such a sobering moment of like, can I trust him and his timing and his goodness? And what does that mean for me? How do I offer my prayer request, but also open-handedly receive whatever he does give me in the timing he gives me? And I think that's where the Enneagram can be so helpful, because I can see more clearly when Jeff is misaligned, but instead of wanting to fix and force him to change, I can come alongside and say, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? Is there something I can do to come alongside you? Now, hey, everyone that's listening, we're still in this like you all. Like we are in the trenches working this daily, but I think the more information we have and the knowledge, it it allows the Holy Spirit to wake us up and to become aware of how to attune to Him and become more like Christ.
Well, I know that we haven't gotten to the remaining parts, the paths, the type 1 for the 4 and the 4 that moves to the type 2, right? Mm-hmm. But I do want to spend these last few moments talking about something because this is really at the heart of Scott's new book.
I love it.
And Scott, I don't know if I've ever actually shared this. I don't know where I got this contraband from, but you had written a series of articles about sort of the gospel-centered life. This would have been early 2000s. I think you had written it whenever you were in St. Louis, and I had gotten a copy of these various articles that were so formative to my thinking. So it was so helpful hearing even themes that you have built upon in your books now that I remember back in those original articles you were writing for the church, which is at the core of the book. And that is this idea of the gospel and how even in our suffering that the gospel is still true. What has it been like for you as a type 4 to experience, to use our confessions, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable love, kindness, forgiveness, and mercy? One, how have you experienced it personally? But then maybe follow up, how does that shape how we experience suffering?
Yeah, so, I go back to the story of Jacob with that question, Jeff, and that place in Genesis where he's wrestling on the ground with God. Mm-hmm. And there's a point where, Jacob says, I will not let you go until you bless me. And that was kind of a eureka moment for Jacob, because that was the moment that God did let go, or that he did let go of God when God, gave him the blessing, and then he got up and sent him off with a limp for the rest of his life. And from that point forward, he becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. But the thing that Jacob had been clinging to all of his life was a wound, because he never got the paternal blessing. He never got the blessing from his father that he craved. He craved it so much that he pretended to be his older brother at a certain point in hopes that he would hear words not meant for him and yet pretend they were being pronounced over him because of this wound. He always lived with the wound of being his father's second favorite child, which is a horrible place to be. The words that Jacob spoke to God were, I will not let you go until you bless me. In other words, that was his eureka moment of recognition that my blessing needs to come from this Father, with whom there is no partiality, and from whom there is this complete, inexhaustible, never-ending love that will not let us go. Which means we can let everything go because he won't let us go. And I think somewhere in there, I'm able to locate my own story, because I grew up, again, without offering too many details, but I grew up just craving a blessing that was my right to have, that was never given. A curse was given in its place, and and this is what my counselor is helping me unravel now in my 50s. Of you're still fighting in some ways. When you're in the shadow place, when you're in the misaligned place, to use your language, you think you're fighting this, but what you're really fighting is that thing from way back. That's that same thing that triggers me to tell myself that I suck because of words I said to somebody in high school in my 50s, when both my daughters are out of high school, let alone me being long out of high school. That same trigger that still wounds you from your shame and your guilt is also a trigger that will go back even further, and you just have to put that fight down, and you've got to row away from it and look for your blessing where the complete blessing can only be found, and that's in the pronouncements of God over us. And that's another way that we can relieve each other and ourselves in marriage as well, right? We so often want to plug our umbilical cords into our spouse or into our children to give us life, and that puts too much pressure on them. That asks them to be more than they have the ability or the capacity to be. Patty cannot be my Jesus. She can be my wife, but she cannot be my Savior any more than I can be her Lord in demanding that she be my Savior, right? But that's like the ironic, wonderful thing about the gospel is having the blessing of God that you so beautifully described a minute ago, Jeff, enables us to let go of maybe the people and the entities like work and other things that we look to for our identity, to let them go. And in letting them go, we actually gain more of them, if that makes sense, right? It's like what Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God, and everything else that your heart craves and longs for will be added back to you, but in a healthy way, in a life-giving way, in a way that you'll never ultimately lose.
I mean, there is a sense that I've known in my own life, and having the privilege of serving as a pastor and seeing people walk through suffering, there is something about longing for the touch of our Father that keeps us animated and striving so hard. There's a part of us that's going to take matters into our own hands and to try to find it somewhere else, but it keeps us moving forward towards God, of longing. So when we see books like yours or read books like yours, it helps us to capture, like, it could be true. It might be true that God is still involved in my life and wants to communicate something of who he is for me in the person and work of Jesus Christ, now given to me abundantly by the Holy Spirit, that helps me to persevere. And that I learned something about who he is. I learned something about who I am. And, like just the story you share, Scott, we're going to walk with the limp. Like the suffering is real. It's not complete healing, but it's such a gift that had I not gone through it, I wouldn't have known it. Tremendously encouraging. Thanks so much, Scott. We really appreciate your candidness, your thoughtfulness, and being willing to engage, and your own heart that leads to great works like your new book.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of sum up real quick, because I know we didn't have the time to go through your type 1 path and your type 2 path, but if I can just summarize the wounded type 4 and the beloved type 4 and how the parts work. So the wounded type 4 feels that there's something defective and flawed, something's missing, and they're longing to restore that idealized sense of themselves. So what's going to happen is the type 3 wounded part is going to show up in trying to convince the 4 to put on a show, to be an image, to play a part. The type 5 is going to convince the 4 that it needs more knowledge, it needs more time away, it needs to isolate, it needs to put up stricter boundaries. The type 1 is going to become more critical of themselves and others for not coming through in the way that they feel like that will help the idealized self come through. And then the type 2 part is going to overly focus on clinging to people and relationships, which actually drowns out the relationship. But when the 4 has the beloved part of their heart at the helm, you're going to see something drastically different. You're going to see the type 4 who is intuitive, depth, has deep emotions, who is able to sit with others. But the 3 part no longer is about the image. It's about coming alongside and cheering that 4 part to keep going, to keep giving their gifts to the world. The type 5 part is going to allow their knowledge to be expressed to the world, so that that 4 part can help not only through the emotions, but the intellect. And then the 1 part is going to come alongside and help the 4 to actually navigate through principles and like steps of procedures. Like, we actually need to put this on the calendar. We need to get this done. We need to know where our keys are, so that so that the gifts that we have aren't going to be pulled back and hindered. And then the type 2 is that part is going to help the 4 not only see their own needs and emotions, but they're going to be able to see the needs and the emotions of others and give forth great blessings of sitting and grieving and listening and being there as a nurturer to others in that space.
I will say this, Scott. There was one moment I went over to Oak Hills. This is when we were in Kansas City, and I think I was hanging out with the pastor who stepped in after you, Russ Ramsey, and
he's on our staff now here in Nashville. He's pastor's one of our congregations. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But I think in the office there were several pieces of equipment that were labeled, and they said that was Scott labeling things.
Yeah, I was a little OCD about things, certain things back then.
Yeah, but I mean, that was your one part coming up.
Coming
in
like,
some
hey.
sense. I mean, to give order to church plants, that's a gift.
Yeah.
But yes, it can become something else.
Well, thanks, Scott, so much for joining us today. Can you just share with people where they can find you and all the work that you do?
So, ScottSauls.com. That's a website where all my stuff is, books, weekly blog you can subscribe to. I write an essay and send it out to people's inboxes every week. And the church that I have the privilege of getting to serve as pastor, Christ Presbyterian in Nashville, among other things. So ScottSauls.com might be the best place to go for that kind of stuff.
Well, thanks for everyone for joining us today, and be sure to share this episode with all the Type 4s in your life and those who have Type 4s in their lives. What we did was in part Enneagram coaching. We'd love for you to personally experience this by connecting with one of our certified Enneagram coaches at myenneagramcoach.com, where you can find someone all around the world. And thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you've really enjoyed this episode talking about the Enneagram Internal Profile, which is the main theme of our new book, More Than Your Number, where you can pick it up anywhere books are sold.
But as always, remember that the Enneagram reveals your need for Jesus, not your need to work harder. It is the gospel that transforms us.